In the shadows of 1930s New York, power didn't belong to the loudest gun or the biggest gang, it belonged to the man who understood structure, timing, and control. While rivals fought over street corners and speakeasies, one figure watched, calculated, and reorganized the entire underworld from the inside. Born in poverty, shaped by chaos, and surrounded by betrayal, he transformed disorder into a system that reached across cities and oceans. This is the story of how scattered gangs became a centralized empire, how loyalty became currency, and how strategy replaced street warfare, creating a criminal machine that would outlast its creator. The year was 1935. In the smoky, dark alleys of New York City, a transformation was taking place, one that would not only reshape the landscape of organized crime but would also end the age of street gangsters. This was the story of Salvatore Lucky Luciano, a figure whose rise to power would not only mark the end of one era but lay the foundation for an empire that would last for decades. But before Luciano's name would echo in the annals of criminal history, there was the underworld, a chaotic, fractured world where control was scattered and power was fluid. A world where the mafia was divided into multiple factions, each one vying for supremacy, and where the reign of mobsters like John Torrio and Al Capone had already begun to fade. Luciano's journey was one of ambition, vision, and brutal determination. To understand how he emerged as the architect of the modern mafia, we need to look back at the fragmented criminal world before his time. The streets of New York were not ruled by a single criminal mind but by many competing forces. Gangs and syndicates operated like isolated kingdoms, with each street boss carving out their own piece of turf. In the early 20th century, the underworld was a wild, untamed place. The mafia families were in constant flux, often at war with each other over territory, business, and influence. Loyalty was shaky, betrayal was rampant, and even the most powerful gangsters found their empires crumbling under the weight of disorganization. For the first time, New York's organized crime seemed like a land of lost opportunities. There was no unity, no central authority to command the respect of all factions. Luciano's rise came during a time when crime, though profitable, was plagued by inefficiency. It was a chaotic game, and Luciano, being a keen observer of human nature, could see that the streets were ripe for a change that would be brutal but necessary. But this chaos, this disunity, was fertile ground for a visionary. Luciano, born to a poor Italian family in 1897, had grown up in the slums of New York, watching his father struggle to make a living. As a young boy, he had witnessed the injustices that came with poverty. He understood the feeling of being invisible, of being pushed aside by the powerful. However, it was in these struggles that Luciano began to see the world differently. He wasn't going to be just another pawn in a world of violence and greed, he was going to be the one pulling the strings. Lucky was small in stature, and his demeanor often betrayed his fierce ambition. His early life on the streets was filled with small-time crimes. But beneath the surface, a grand vision began to form. While other gangsters were focused on short-term gains, Luciano understood the bigger picture. He wasn't just aiming to be the top dog in a street corner gang. He wanted to reshape the entire mafia structure. Unlike the street gangsters around him who operated on chaos and fear, Luciano's mind worked in calculated precision. He saw criminal enterprises as businesses to be run efficiently, with loyalty being a currency to be managed rather than demanded. His thinking was revolutionary for a time when mobsters viewed their organizations as mere extensions of their own egos, rather than as a collective force to be wielded. In the years leading up to his rise, Luciano navigated the rough streets, making strategic alliances with various figures in the mafia, from the likes of the old-school mafia bosses to the newer, younger generation that would eventually come to dominate under his leadership. With each connection, Luciano would slowly build a network, a silent army of men who would eventually play crucial roles in his grand design. Yet it wasn't all smooth sailing. During this time, Luciano made enemies, men who would become a part of his story's darker chapters. One of the most significant challenges Luciano faced was dealing with the influence of older, entrenched bosses like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. These men represented the old guard of the mafia, an era where the underworld was ruled by the strength of one man's authority. These bosses often engaged in violent turf wars, and loyalty was maintained through fear and violence, not business strategy. Luciano saw the fallacy in this approach. He was methodical, and the bloodshed that defined this period made it clear to him that in order to survive, and eventually thrive, he would need to completely shift the power structure. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to think beyond the immediate power struggles of the street. He began to form alliances with figures like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, men who would play significant roles in his future reign. But it wasn't just about alliances. Luciano was a master manipulator. He played both sides, siding with Masuria when necessary, and then later betraying him when the time was right. The fact that he could maintain his position of power, constantly shifting allegiances, showcased his ability to think in the long term. While others were fighting wars, he was preparing to end them. The shift from street gang warfare to organized crime was not immediate. It required strategic moves, calculated risk, and a ruthless disregard for anyone standing in his way. Luciano's ambition had led him to a clear conclusion: to unite the mafia, to make it a cohesive force rather than a collection of disconnected empires, would be the key to success. His early dealings with Masuria and Maranzano were a test, a battle for supremacy in which he played the role of the quiet schemer, always watching, always planning. The turning point came with the infamous Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that would prove to be the crucible in which Luciano's vision would come to fruition. The war, fought between the factions of Masuria and Maranzano, was a struggle for control of the mafia. Luciano, playing both sides, ultimately turned on Masuria, orchestrating his assassination. It was a pivotal moment, one that would change the course of mafia history forever. With Masuria out of the picture, Luciano was able to negotiate a peace with Maranzano, effectively ending the war. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for the Commission, a governing body that would centralize control over the mafia, uniting all the families under a single framework. Luciano's success wasn't just in his ability to make power moves, it was in his psychological grasp of human nature. He understood that loyalty wasn't simply a matter of fear, it was a matter of trust, of mutual benefit. Under Luciano, the mafia became a more corporate, less chaotic organization, where power was centralized and men could rise based on merit rather than violence. In many ways, he transformed the mafia from a patchwork of street gangs into a professional, organized criminal network. Luciano's rise signified more than just the end of an era of street gangsters. It marked the birth of a new age in organized crime. His genius lay not only in his ability to manage power but in his ability to create a system that lasted. By the time he had consolidated his power, he had redefined the mafia and changed the course of American crime. What Luciano built would survive for decades, far beyond the days of the street gangsters. And yet, even as he built his empire, the streets that had raised him would always remain part of his story, forever intertwined with the rise of a man who would change the underworld forever. Before Luciano's emergence, the criminal world in New York City was a chaotic and fragmented place. The streets, particularly in areas like Little Italy and the Lower East Side, were controlled by various factions of street gangs, each one vying for dominance over specific territories. This wasn't an organized system. It was more a collection of small-time, independent operations, where the rule of the strongest prevailed. Gangs fought each other constantly over control of bootlegging routes, gambling dens and prostitution rings. There was no central authority, no unified structure, just bloodshed, betrayal, and constant warfare. The streets were alive with tension, but that very tension was what allowed men like Luciano to rise. The mafia, as we think of it today, hadn't been fully formed yet. The term itself had been used to describe groups of Sicilian criminals for decades, but it wasn't until the 1920s that an actual underworld organization began to take shape in the United States. The chaos that defined this early period of organized crime had its roots in the Prohibition era. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, the demand for bootleg liquor skyrocketed, leading to a massive expansion in organized crime. But the distribution of illegal alcohol wasn't just controlled by a single gang. In fact, various factions within the mafia and other criminal organizations scrambled to take control of the lucrative market, often resorting to violence and intimidation to expand their territories. At the heart of this disarray were two figures who were seen as the dominant forces in New York's criminal world: Salvatore Maranzano and Giuseppe Masuria. They represented two rival factions that were locked in an ongoing power struggle for control over the New York mafia. Maranzano, who had arrived from Sicily in the early 1900s, was a traditionalist who sought to create a hierarchical structure similar to the old-world Sicilian mafia. He envisioned a centralized organization with himself at the top, ruling as the capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. Masuria, on the other hand, was a more ruthless, violent figure who operated with sheer brutality and intimidation. His organization relied on muscle and fear to maintain control. Despite their differences, both men recognized the need for order in the midst of the disarray. They understood that if they were to control the vast wealth that came with bootlegging, gambling, and other criminal enterprises, They would need to eliminate the chaos and create a more organized structure. However, their method of doing so was entirely different. While Masuria was determined to impose his power through violence and aggression, Maranzano sought a more formalized approach, rooted in old Sicilian traditions. Neither of these men had the vision or the flexibility to adapt to the rapidly changing landscape of organized crime in America. Enter Lucky Luciano. By the time he came onto the scene, Luciano had already been involved in the underworld for a number of years. He wasn't a stranger to the violence and chaos of street gangs, having grown up on the tough streets of New York. But what set Luciano apart from the older generation of mobsters was his ability to see beyond the bloodshed and the brutality. Where Maranzano and Masuria saw their power struggles as a matter of survival, Luciano saw them as a temporary and inefficient phase. He believed that in order to thrive, the mafia needed to be modernized and streamlined, a vision that was unthinkable to the old-world mobsters at the time. At this point, the mafia in New York was still very much a product of the past. It was a patchwork of different, often conflicting, street gangs. There were few rules governing behavior, and loyalty was frequently a matter of fear. Bosses like Masuria and Maranzano ruled through intimidation, with little regard for the larger picture. They were playing a game of territorial conquest, each one trying to outdo the other. They were not thinking about the future of organized crime as a whole, but rather about the here and now, about who controlled what and who could exert the most influence. Luciano, however, had a different vision. He recognized that in order to truly consolidate power, he needed to unite these disparate factions and bring them together under a single, organized structure. The system he imagined wasn't built on brute force or violence, it was based on business. Luciano understood that the mafia wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was a multi-million-dollar business. To operate like a business, it needed to be organized and efficient. It needed leadership, structure, and loyalty based on mutual interest rather than fear. The only way to achieve this in Luciano's eyes was to end the power struggle and create a unified mafia. In Luciano's vision, the mafia would function like a corporation, with a board of directors, each representing one of the major families, coming together to make key decisions. These families would operate under the umbrella of a central leadership, but each family would maintain its own autonomy. In many ways, Luciano's idea was radical. It would require getting the various factions to accept a central authority, which was something that had never existed before in the history of organized crime. But Luciano was a master strategist. He knew that the current state of the mafia was unsustainable, and he believed he could take advantage of the situation. However, the old guard wasn't ready to let go of their power so easily. Both Maranzano and Masuria, despite their differences, were powerful men who commanded great respect in the underworld. They didn't see the need for any changes, and they certainly didn't see Luciano as a threat. In fact, Luciano initially aligned himself with Masuria, seeing him as a way to move up the ranks. Luciano's ability to navigate these treacherous waters was part of what made him so dangerous. While he appeared loyal to Masuria, he was quietly building his own network of supporters. He was patient, calculating, and willing to bide his time. The turning point came with the infamous Castellamarese War, which was a bloody conflict between Masuria and Maranzano. Luciano, who had grown disillusioned with both men, saw this war as an opportunity to implement his vision. He knew that the war had no real end in sight, and that it was only draining the mafia's resources. Luciano's genius was in understanding that both Masuria and Maranzano represented the old guard, a way of doing things that was outdated, inefficient, and ultimately destructive. In the midst of the war, Luciano made a bold move. He turned against Masuria. It was a calculated decision that would change the course of mafia history. He arranged for Masuria to be killed, marking the end of an era and the beginning of Luciano's rise to power. Maranzano, who had emerged as the dominant figure in the aftermath of Masuria's death, didn't realize that he, too, was a part of the old guard. Luciano's betrayal of Masuria was just the first step in a much larger plan, one that would ultimately see him replace Maranzano as the new power broker in the mafia. With Masuria dead and Maranzano on the throne, Luciano began to move in the shadows, slowly building alliances with men who would later become key players in his new vision for the mafia. His ultimate goal was clear: to unify the fractured families and establish a centralized power structure. The days of street gang violence were over. What Luciano envisioned was something far more sophisticated, an organized, business-like operation that would allow the mafia to survive and thrive in the modern world. Luciano understood that the future of organized crime wasn't in brute force or territorial conquest. It was in creating a system that could weather the changing times. And that's exactly what he did. By the end of the Castellamarese War, Luciano was positioned to become the most powerful figure in the mafia, and he had laid the groundwork for a new era of organized crime, one that would be based on loyalty, order, and, above all, control. Luciano's early years on the streets of New York were shaped by the harshness of his environment. Born to poor Sicilian immigrants in 1897, he grew up in the slums of the Lower East Side, a place where survival often meant embracing a harsh code of conduct. His family's financial struggles were a constant presence, and from a young age, Luciano witnessed the disparity between the lives of the powerful and the powerless. His father, a laborer, struggled to provide for his family, and the young Salvatore would soon learn that in a city like New York, power was the key to escaping poverty. From the outset, Luciano was no stranger to the criminal world. The Lower East Side was a melting pot of immigrants, each group trying to carve out a space for itself in the rapidly changing city. For a young Italian boy like Luciano, the street gangs of New York were a natural point of entry. By the time he was a teenager, he was already involved in petty crimes. Pickpocketing, gambling, and petty theft became his first tastes of power. Yet even in these early years, Luciano demonstrated a natural cunning, a keen sense for navigating the precarious world of crime. While other boys his age were following the traditional path of street-level gang activity, Luciano was already beginning to think bigger. He understood that in this world, the key to success was not simply committing more crimes, it was about building a network of influence and learning how to manipulate the game to his advantage. At the age of 14, Luciano had already earned a reputation among the local gang members. His early mentors were men who had a similar vision for the future of crime, men who saw opportunities not just in the immediate hustle but in the larger picture. They taught him the art of strategy, how to work the system, how to win people over, and most importantly, how to remain unnoticed while doing so. In the world Luciano was entering, subtlety was as important as violence. The young Luciano, though unremarkable in appearance, small, slight, and often overlooked, had an instinct for the deeper currents of power that swirled beneath the surface. He wasn't interested in just being a street thug. He had his eyes on a much larger prize. His natural aptitude for networking and manipulating situations made him stand out in a world where brute force was often more highly regarded. By the age of 17, Luciano had already made his first serious move within the criminal underworld. He became involved in the world of gambling, bootlegging, and extortion, key pillars of the burgeoning mafia economy. It was during this time that he came into contact with some of the more established figures in the underworld, men who would become his mentors and, eventually, his rivals. The path to power was never straightforward, and Luciano's early years were marked by alliances, betrayals, and a growing sense that the world around him was rife with opportunity, if only he could capitalize on it. One of Luciano's early influences was Arnold, the Brain Rothstein, a figure who had long been a prominent figure in the world of New York's gambling scene. Rothstein was not a street thug but a man who operated with quiet intelligence and a sense of methodical calculation. He was known for his ability to run criminal enterprises without ever getting his hands dirty. To Luciano, Rothstein was a role model, an example of how to operate within the underworld without attracting undue attention. Rothstein's approach to crime was cerebral, and it resonated deeply with Luciano. He saw in Rothstein the possibility of transforming the criminal world from a chaotic, violent mess into a more organized and profitable business. He began to study Rothstein's methods, learning how to make connections and how to manage multiple operations without ever stepping into the spotlight. But while Rothstein's influence was significant, it was another figure, Joe the Boss Masuria, who would have the most direct impact on Luciano's early career. Masuria, one of the most powerful mobsters in New York at the time, was a force to be reckoned with. He was a brute, a man whose control over his territory was maintained by force and intimidation. Masuria's style was in stark contrast to Rothstein's, but it was this very contrast that attracted Luciano. The young gangster understood that in order to truly succeed, he needed to understand the nature of both types of power, the quiet, cerebral power that Rothstein embodied, and the raw, unyielding power that Masuria wielded. It was a lesson that would prove invaluable as Luciano began to make his own moves within the mafia. As Luciano grew in stature, his relationships with the power brokers of the city became increasingly complex. He understood that to rise in the ranks he needed to form alliances with the right people and quickly. He was a master at reading people, at knowing when to strike and when to lay low. But he was also ambitious, and his ambition made him willing to take risks that other men would never consider. This was evident when he made the decision to become involved in the business of bootlegging during Prohibition, a move that would prove to be pivotal in his rise to power. Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 to 1933, created a massive black market for alcohol, and the mafia quickly capitalized on this opportunity. The illegal distribution of alcohol became a highly profitable enterprise, and Luciano was no exception in seeing its potential. As the demand for illegal liquor surged, Luciano saw an opportunity to create an underground network of speakeasies, liquor distributors, and smugglers that would be both highly profitable and incredibly difficult to dismantle. It was during this time that Luciano's business acumen began to shine through. He understood that crime was not just about violence, it was about managing resources, making deals, and building relationships with the right people. By the early 1920s, Luciano had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with. He was making money hand over fist, and his reputation was growing. But despite his success, he remained dissatisfied with the chaotic nature of the underworld. The patchwork of small-time criminals, each controlling their own turf, was inefficient. Luciano believed that the future of the mafia was in unity, in the creation of a single, organized entity that could operate more like a corporation than a gang of street thugs. This was the idea that would eventually form the backbone of his criminal empire. Luciano's thinking was radical for the time. He knew that to consolidate power, he would need to bring together the various factions of the mafia. The fragmented nature of the underworld was not sustainable. Luciano's vision was simple but revolutionary. He sought to create a unified organization where each family would operate under a central authority, with clearly defined rules and a chain of command. This would be a mafia that operated like a business, with profits carefully managed and operations running smoothly. It wasn't about the violence and chaos that had previously defined the mafia, it was about control, about managing resources efficiently, and about securing long-term prosperity. Luciano's early years were filled with both successes and failures, but every experience contributed to the man he would become. He learned the importance of patience, of building alliances, and of knowing when to make a bold move. He understood the value of loyalty, but also recognized that loyalty in the criminal world was often a matter of mutual benefit rather than blind obedience. It was a lesson he would carry with him throughout his career. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Luciano had already built a powerful network of allies, and his vision for the future of the mafia was beginning to take shape. He had learned from the old-school gangsters, but his mind was already focused on something far greater. The days of street gang violence were numbered. Luciano was preparing to change the world of organized crime forever. As the years passed, Luciano's ambition only grew. What had begun as a series of small-time hustles and petty crimes had expanded into a full-fledged empire of illicit enterprises. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Luciano's criminal network had become both sophisticated and highly profitable. However, despite his success, one thing was clear: the fragmented, chaotic world of New York's underworld was not sustainable. Luciano knew that in order to fully dominate the mafia, he would need to reorganize it, reshape it into something far more cohesive, efficient, and centralized. The time had come to stop operating like a street gang and start running a criminal enterprise like a business. In Luciano's mind, the mafia was not simply a collection of thugs operating on a few street corners, it could be much more than that. He envisioned a system where families would operate like departments within a corporation, each responsible for a specific aspect of the mafia's business, whether it was bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, or labor unions. The goal was to create a unified structure that would allow the mafia to function smoothly, eliminating infighting and turf wars that drained resources and morale. But more than just a business model, Luciano also realized that he needed to shift the culture of the mafia itself. The old ways, rooted in violence, fear, and tradition, were no longer sufficient to manage the scale of organized crime that Luciano had in mind. He needed to establish loyalty through mutual respect and personal gain, not just through coercion and fear. To achieve this, Luciano began consolidating power. He knew that in order to successfully implement his vision, he would need to take down the old guard, men like Joe Masuria, who represented the chaotic, violent, and inefficient ways of the past. Masuria had once been a powerful boss, but by the time Luciano had begun his ascent, he was seen as a relic of an earlier, more brutal era. Masuria's style of leadership was based on intimidation, and while this had worked for a time, it was not an approach that could sustain the growing complexity of organized crime. Masuria's brute force tactics were becoming increasingly ineffective as law enforcement grew more sophisticated, and Luciano saw this weakness as an opportunity. Luciano began making calculated moves against Masuria, slowly maneuvering himself into a position where he could eventually replace him. But he knew this wouldn't be easy. Masuria was no fool. he had vast influence and an army of loyal followers. The first step in Luciano's strategy was to distance himself from Masuria's direct control, positioning himself as a rising star in his own right while still maintaining the appearance of loyalty. This careful balancing act would set the stage for Luciano's eventual betrayal. During this time, Luciano built key alliances with other mobsters, many of whom would later become the power players in his new vision for the mafia. One of these men was Frank Costello, a suave and intelligent figure who had a reputation for being a shrewd businessman rather than a street brawler. Costello's style complemented Luciano's own. While Luciano was the mastermind, Costello was the operator who could help manage the mafia's business dealings with a level of finesse that would prove invaluable. Luciano also forged an alliance with Vito Genovese, who, like Costello, was a man with a strategic mind and the ability to execute plans with precision. These alliances were crucial because they represented a shift away from the old guard's approach to crime. Luciano's next move was to target Salvatore Maranzano, who had risen to prominence as a result of the Castellamarese War and had declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. Maranzano's vision for the mafia was similarly rooted in old-world Sicilian traditions, with an authoritarian structure that placed him at the top. Luciano knew that in order to establish a new world order within the mafia, he would have to take Maranzano down as well. While Maranzano had gained the upper hand after the death of Masuria, Luciano had no intention of letting him maintain control. Maranzano's days were numbered. Luciano, aided by his trusted allies, executed a brilliant move. He betrayed Maranzano by orchestrating his assassination, effectively eliminating the last remaining piece of the old guard that stood in his way. Maranzano's death marked the end of the Castellamarese War and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the mafia. Luciano had achieved what few before him had even dared to dream. He had successfully unified the mafia under his own leadership. With Maranzano gone, Luciano was able to establish the Commission, a governing body made up of the leaders of the various mafia families. This was a groundbreaking move. For the first time in history, the mafia would be governed by a collective body, with power divided equally among the families, rather than being controlled by a single boss. The Commission was a direct reflection of Luciano's business acumen. It provided a platform for resolving disputes, regulating business operations, and maintaining peace among the families. It was also a means of consolidating power in a way that would ensure the survival of Luciano's empire. By this point, Luciano had essentially transformed the mafia into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The old street gang mentality was gone, replaced by a highly organized network of crime families operating like a well-oiled machine. Each family had its own areas of influence, but all were united under the Commission, which allowed Luciano to maintain control while giving the families a sense of autonomy. His vision of a unified mafia was beginning to take shape, and he began expanding the organization's operations beyond New York City. Luciano's criminal empire grew exponentially. He expanded his operations into gambling, narcotics, unions, and labor racketeering. He struck deals with corrupt politicians, law enforcement, and businessmen, creating a vast web of influence that allowed him to operate with near impunity. His methodical approach to crime allowed him to stay one step ahead of law enforcement, while his growing network of loyal allies ensured that his empire remained stable. The mafia, under Luciano's rule, was no longer just about violence. It was about control, efficiency, and above all, profit. Yet, despite his growing empire, Luciano's rise wasn't without challenges. His efforts to consolidate power often led to rivalries with other crime figures, and his increasing influence attracted the attention of law enforcement, who were beginning to crack down on organized crime. But Luciano was prepared for these challenges. He understood the importance of keeping a low profile and was careful to keep his own hands clean, allowing others to take the heat for the more visible aspects of the mafia's operations. His leadership was characterized by his ability to balance power and diplomacy. Unlike other mobsters who ruled through fear and violence, Luciano's approach was more cerebral. He understood the importance of alliances and kept the various families loyal to him through mutual benefit rather than intimidation. He also worked to protect his own family and associates from prosecution, often using his political connections to avoid trouble with the law. But his greatest strength lay in his ability to maintain control over a sprawling network of criminal enterprises while keeping his own role largely in the background. As Luciano's influence continued to grow, so too did his reputation. He became known as the man who had transformed the mafia from a disjointed collection of street gangs into a powerful, well-organized criminal empire. His ability to unify the various factions of the mafia was unmatched, and his businesslike approach to crime made him one of the most respected and feared figures in the criminal underworld. Luciano had not only changed the mafia, he had redefined what it meant to be a gangster. And in doing so, he had set the stage for the mafia's dominance in the coming decades. The Code of Silence, omerta, was the backbone of the mafia. It was a rule that defined the underworld's unwritten constitution, binding its members with an unspoken yet sacred oath of loyalty. But for Lucky Luciano, this wasn't just a code to be followed. It was a tool to be manipulated, an instrument that could be wielded with precision to create an empire built on fear, respect, and ultimately control. The principle of omerta wasn't merely a declaration of silence in the face of the law. It was the very glue that held the mafia together. Without it, the entire organization would collapse into chaos, and the delicate web Luciano had woven would unravel. At its core, omerta demanded absolute loyalty to the family and its leaders. In the context of the mafia, loyalty was not about trust in the conventional sense. It was about ensuring that each member was bound by a sense of duty, a debt owed to the organization that was enforced not just by fear of punishment but by an intrinsic understanding of the power that silence afforded them. Under this code, betraying the mafia or cooperating with the authorities was unforgivable. It wasn't just an act of disloyalty, it was an existential threat to the very structure of the mafia. Those who broke the silence were subject to brutal retribution, typically death. But while the outward appearances of omerta were built on silence and loyalty, the reality of how Luciano used it was far more complex. He understood the nuances of power and human behavior in ways few others did. Omerta wasn't just a blind adherence to silence in the face of interrogation or police pressure. It was a tool that gave Luciano a distinct advantage over his competitors. In the world Luciano navigated, loyalty could be bought, sold, and shifted according to the tides of power. While some leaders viewed loyalty as an unbreakable bond, Luciano recognized it as a fluid asset, one that could be strategically placed to achieve the long-term goals of his criminal empire. His mastery of this concept allowed him to build a mafia that operated with a corporate efficiency, where loyalty was maintained through mutual benefits, not fear alone. Luciano's brand of omerta was grounded in his understanding of the psychological forces that govern human behavior. He knew that while fear was essential, loyalty could not thrive if it was based solely on fear. Fear alone would create a volatile foundation, one that could lead to rebellion, distrust, and betrayal. Instead, Luciano's system was built on the idea that loyalty could be cultivated through shared interests and rewards. Under his rule, the mafia became more than just a collection of men bound by terror. It became a collection of men who were incentivized to follow the code because it directly benefited them. At the heart of this loyalty was Luciano's ability to create value for his men. Where other bosses relied on brute force and intimidation to ensure loyalty, Luciano worked to create a system in which the mafia could provide financial success and security for its members. He made sure that even the lowliest soldiers in his ranks had a stake in the mafia's success. The power to make money, whether through gambling, bootlegging, labor unions, or the protection rackets, was the currency that ensured loyalty in Luciano's world. This wasn't just a matter of getting rich, it was about establishing a system where the mafia was indispensable to its members, ensuring that no one would willingly break the code of silence. While Luciano did not shy away from using violence as a tool, his preference was for diplomacy and strategy. When he needed to consolidate power or eliminate a rival, he could do so ruthlessly. But even then, he understood the importance of making sure that any violence that took place was purposeful and calculated. He wasn't interested in the random chaos that marked the reign of previous mafia leaders. Instead, he preferred to use violence sparingly, only when absolutely necessary to maintain control or send a message. He understood that violence, while effective in the short term, could alienate potential allies and undermine the long-term stability of his empire. For Luciano, the real strength of omerta was that it allowed him to operate in plain sight, even as he controlled an entire underground empire. As the mafia became more structured and integrated into legitimate businesses, Luciano was able to remain behind the scenes while his lieutenants and allies did the dirty work. This allowed him to escape the law's reach for years, even as his criminal empire grew. He could walk freely in public, shaking hands with politicians, businessmen, and union leaders, all while his men worked quietly to maintain the criminal operations that fueled his empire. Luciano was also keenly aware of the psychological warfare that came with maintaining loyalty. He knew that loyalty in the mafia wasn't just about obedience, it was about respect. Respect was a powerful motivator, especially in a world where men like Luciano understood that violence was not the only way to maintain control. He worked tirelessly to cultivate respect among his men, ensuring that they saw him as both a leader and a benefactor. His men were willing to endure hardships and take risks because they understood that Luciano was a leader who would protect them in return. And because loyalty was nurtured through respect, they were far more likely to remain loyal in the face of external pressures. This was an essential part of Luciano's strategy for transforming the mafia. Unlike the street gangs of the past, where loyalty was enforced through fear and intimidation, Luciano built a mafia where loyalty was earned and rewarded. Under his leadership, the mafia was no longer a ragtag group of criminals. It was a structured organization in which each member had a role to play and a stake in its success. Luciano didn't just demand loyalty. He cultivated it, ensuring that every man in the mafia knew that his loyalty would be returned with power and prosperity. Yet, the very nature of loyalty was not without its complications. While Luciano's method of incentivizing loyalty through mutual gain was highly effective, it also came with a certain level of danger. The more men that became invested in the mafia's success, the more vulnerable the organization became to betrayal. The system of loyalty Luciano created relied on trust, and while trust was vital to maintaining control, it was also fragile. A single breach of trust could send shockwaves through the entire organization. Luciano knew that the mafia's survival depended not only on keeping his men loyal but on keeping them divided, ensuring that no one man ever became powerful enough to challenge him. This division was key to maintaining control. Luciano deliberately kept rival factions within the mafia. He worked to ensure that no one family or group of men became too powerful, thus preventing anyone from consolidating enough influence to challenge his authority. Even though loyalty was cultivated through mutual respect and shared success, Luciano also ensured that no one individual or faction could dominate the organization. This constant balancing act was another reflection of Luciano's genius as a strategist. By maintaining division within the ranks, he ensured that no one could ever form a strong enough coalition to usurp his rule. The Code of Omerta, under Luciano's leadership, was not simply about silence. It was about the careful maintenance of power. Luciano understood that the strength of the mafia came from its unity, but unity could only exist if each member had a reason to remain loyal. His redefinition of loyalty, grounded in mutual benefit and respect, allowed him to create a criminal empire that was both efficient and nearly untouchable by the law. It was a delicate balance of power, and Luciano was the master at managing it. In the years that followed, as his empire grew and expanded, Luciano would continue to refine this balance. He would use the power of Omerta to shield his organization from outside threats, and he would use loyalty to bind his men together in a system that worked for everyone, from the lowliest soldier to the most powerful bosses. And as the mafia began to operate more like a business, with families working together rather than competing against each other, it became clear that Luciano's vision of the mafia was not just revolutionary, it was transformative. The world of organized crime would never be the same. As Luciano's vision for the mafia began to take shape, one of the core elements of his plan was the creation of an organized, profitable, and above all efficient system of criminal enterprise. Luciano understood that to truly consolidate power, the mafia could no longer function as a fragmented collection of street gangs or loosely connected families. It needed to operate with the precision of a well-managed business, and at the heart of this business was the maximization of profit. To achieve this, Luciano revolutionized the way the mafia approached its operations, turning what had once been a chaotic series of independent rackets into a global criminal empire that would transcend borders, attract vast wealth, and ensure long-term dominance. The first step in Luciano's reorganization of the mafia was to expand its operations beyond the traditional confines of New York City. While the mafia had always been involved in illicit activities like bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, Luciano realized that the true potential of these enterprises could be unlocked by structuring them into a larger, more coordinated operation. He envisioned a system where the different families would work together, rather than in competition with each other, to maximize profits. The days of street-level turf wars and petty rivalries were over. Instead, Luciano proposed a system where each family would be responsible for a specific criminal enterprise, but all would contribute to a centralized, well-run organization. Bootlegging was one of the first and most lucrative industries that Luciano targeted for reorganization. The Prohibition era had created a massive demand for illegal alcohol, and the mafia was uniquely positioned to exploit this demand. However, Luciano knew that simply producing and distributing alcohol wasn't enough. The business needed to be scaled, streamlined, and protected. He understood that the key to controlling the bootlegging industry was to create a monopoly on distribution and establish connections with corrupt politicians, law enforcement, and business owners. He was adept at securing protection and silencing opposition, ensuring that his operations remained undisturbed. Luciano's innovations in the bootlegging business were groundbreaking, and under his leadership, it became a highly profitable and efficient operation. But bootlegging was only one aspect of the broader criminal empire Luciano sought to create. He knew that in order to maximize profits, the mafia needed to diversify its operations. Gambling had long been a staple of organized crime, but Luciano saw an opportunity to make it even more profitable by organizing the various gambling rackets into a unified, efficient operation. He brokered deals with owners of illegal casinos, bookies, and numbers runners, bringing them into the fold of his growing empire. In doing so, Luciano created a network of gambling operations that spanned the country, from the streets of New York to the casinos of Las Vegas, turning gambling from a patchwork of independent operations into a well-oiled, centralized business. Along with bootlegging and gambling, Luciano also recognized the tremendous potential in labor racketeering. During the 1930s, labor unions had significant influence over American workers, and the mafia saw an opportunity to exploit this power. Luciano, with his political connections and shrewd negotiating tactics, managed to place his men in key positions within unions, particularly in industries like construction and trucking. This allowed the mafia to extort businesses for protection money and secure lucrative contracts for its operations. By the end of the decade, Luciano's influence over the labor movement was so extensive that it extended into virtually every major industry in the United States. The mafia had gone from a local street gang to a multinational, multi-industry criminal organization. Luciano's approach to criminal enterprise was revolutionary not only because of its scope but because of how it managed resources. He understood that success in the criminal world didn't just come from having muscle, it came from having a structured organization that could allocate resources efficiently, make quick decisions, and respond to external threats. To this end, Luciano restructured the mafia into a more business-like entity, with a clear hierarchy of leadership and responsibility. He set up a system of oversight where each family operated semi-autonomously but reported back to a central authority, with each boss responsible for a particular racket. This division of labor ensured that the mafia could operate at full capacity without becoming bogged down in infighting or disorganization. At the same time, Luciano worked tirelessly to forge alliances with other criminal organizations, both within the United States and abroad. He understood that in order to ensure the long-term success of his empire, he needed to secure relationships with key players in other countries, particularly in Europe and South America. Luciano was one of the first mafia leaders to recognize the global potential of organized crime, and he began to establish connections with criminals in places like Havana, Cuba, and Sicily. These alliances proved invaluable in expanding Luciano's reach and in diversifying the mafia's operations. The link between Luciano's operations and legitimate businesses was also crucial to his success. Unlike many of his contemporaries who remained mired in illegal activities, Luciano was always mindful of the need to infiltrate the legitimate economy. He knew that a truly successful criminal empire needed to operate both above and below the surface, with ties to legitimate businesses that could launder the mafia's ill-gotten gains and provide a cover for its criminal activities. This connection to legitimate business also allowed Luciano to exert influence in political and corporate circles, giving him a level of protection that other crime bosses lacked. Luciano's management of the mafia was marked by his ability to maintain a delicate balance between control and autonomy. While he was the undisputed leader of the organization, he also knew that in order for the mafia to thrive, each family needed to operate with a degree of independence. This allowed the families to grow their own businesses and maintain their own power bases, while still being part of a larger, unified operation. Luciano's ability to delegate authority to his subordinates, while maintaining oversight, was a hallmark of his leadership style. He was not a micromanager but rather a visionary who understood the importance of fostering loyalty and trust among his underlings. His leadership was characterized by a pragmatic approach to business, where the ultimate goal was always profit and survival. Luciano's empire was not without its challenges, however. As his criminal network grew, so too did the attention it attracted from law enforcement. The federal government, in particular, was keen on dismantling the mafia and other criminal organizations that were thriving during the Great Depression. Despite the increasing pressure from the authorities, Luciano remained largely untouchable, thanks in part to his ability to maintain a low profile and his extensive network of allies in politics and law enforcement. While many of his contemporaries were caught up in violent confrontations or scandals, Luciano kept his hands clean, allowing others to take the fall for the more visible aspects of the mafia's operations. But while Luciano's empire seemed invincible, it was also fragile. The more powerful the mafia became, the more susceptible it was to internal power struggles and external threats. Luciano understood that in order to preserve his empire, he needed to continually adapt to the changing landscape of crime and law enforcement. His ability to stay ahead of the authorities, while also managing the complex web of relationships within the mafia, was a testament to his skill as both a criminal mastermind and a businessman. By the time Luciano was at the height of his power, the mafia had become a well-oiled machine, operating on a global scale with a vast array of criminal enterprises. Bootlegging, gambling, labor racketeering, and narcotics trafficking were just the tip of the iceberg. Luciano had created an empire that was as profitable as it was dangerous, and he had transformed the mafia from a group of ragtag street thugs into a global criminal syndicate that could rival any legitimate business. His legacy as the man who redefined organized crime was cemented, and his influence would continue to be felt for decades to come. As Luciano's influence continued to grow, so did the complexity of his world. With the expansion of his empire, the dynamics of the underworld shifted, creating an environment where alliances were as important as power, and where betrayal could come from anywhere. The mafia's landscape was no longer limited to the streets of New York or the shadows of illicit speakeasies. It had become a sprawling network, with ties reaching across the United States and abroad. Luciano's ability to navigate this dangerous terrain, balancing loyalty and ambition, played a critical role in his ascent to the apex of organized crime. The rise of such power inevitably attracted both allies and enemies. One of the most pivotal aspects of Luciano's rule was his ability to forge and maintain alliances with other mafia families, rival gangs, and even external criminal organizations. His influence wasn't built on sheer violence or intimidation alone. It was constructed from the subtle art of diplomacy, strategy, and manipulation. Unlike many of his predecessors who ruled through brute force, Luciano's genius lay in his understanding of human nature, particularly the ways in which loyalty could be fostered and rivalries could be managed. He was a master of both coercion and persuasion, knowing when to push and when to make concessions. It was this blend of pragmatism and ruthlessness that allowed him to build relationships with men who, at first glance, might seem to be his enemies. One such relationship was with Frank Costello, who would become one of Luciano's closest allies. Costello, a man with a calm and calculating demeanor, was more businessman than gangster. His cool-headedness and ability to navigate the world of high society made him an invaluable partner to Luciano. The two men shared a mutual respect and understanding of each other's skills, and together they formed a partnership that would allow Luciano to expand his reach far beyond the traditional criminal circles. Costello was particularly useful in helping Luciano establish connections with legitimate businessmen and politicians, an area where Luciano himself wasn't as adept. By aligning himself with Costello, Luciano was able to secure the mafia's foothold in the legitimate world, gaining influence over unions, businesses, and even the political establishment. But while Costello was an important ally, the nature of the mafia world was never so simple. Rivalries were inevitable, especially when power was at stake. Luciano's rise to power wasn't without opposition. One of his most significant adversaries was Vito Genovese, a powerful figure in the mafia who had once been an ally but became one of Luciano's most dangerous foes. Genovese's ambitions were as large as Luciano's, and as Luciano consolidated his control over the various mafia families, Genovese began to grow resentful of his subordinate position. The seeds of a bitter rivalry were planted as Genovese's aspirations to take control of the mafia clashed with Luciano's already established authority. Genovese's ambitions led to a series of power plays that culminated in a brutal struggle for dominance. He attempted to undermine Luciano's authority by attempting to gain favor with the powerful bosses in the commission. Genovese's efforts were a direct challenge to Luciano's rule, and the tension between the two men escalated. Luciano was well aware of Genovese's ambitions, and although the two men had once shared a relationship of mutual respect, the nature of the underworld meant that only one could hold the top spot. It became clear that their rivalry was inevitable, and Luciano, ever the pragmatist, made the decision to eliminate Genovese as a threat before he became too powerful. The struggle between Luciano and Genovese was not just a battle for control of the mafia, it was also a battle for the future of the organization. Luciano's vision for the mafia was one of unity and centralization, a highly organized syndicate where each family had its role and responsibility, yet all would report to the commission. In contrast, Genovese's vision was rooted in old-world Sicilian tradition, where power was concentrated in the hands of a single leader. The ideological rift between the two men would have far-reaching consequences for the future of organized crime, especially as they began to clash over territory, control, and power. The tension came to a head when Genovese made a bold move to assassinate Luciano's closest allies. He believed that by removing key members of Luciano's inner circle, he could weaken Luciano's position and force him to surrender control of the mafia. However, Luciano, ever the step ahead, had anticipated this move. His strategy was calculated and precise. Rather than engage in an all-out war with Genovese, Luciano orchestrated a careful series of actions that would eventually result in Genovese's downfall. Luciano's ability to balance his relationships with rivals and allies was a key element in maintaining his control over the mafia. His leadership wasn't just about brute force, it was about strategic manipulation, anticipating the moves of both friends and foes. Every decision was calculated, every alliance a potential threat or opportunity. And yet, the deeper Luciano's control grew, the more fragile it became. The very success of his empire made it a target for both outside forces and internal discontent. The loyalty that had once defined the mafia was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, as more and more men in the organization began to question their role in the greater scheme of things. As the rivalry with Genovese simmered, Luciano also had to contend with the increasing pressure from law enforcement. The more successful his operations became, the more determined the authorities were to bring him down. Luciano's ability to keep a low profile in public, while his men ran the day-to-day operations, helped shield him from some of the heat. He understood the importance of being seen as a legitimate businessman, while still pulling the strings behind the scenes. However, as the reach of his empire grew, so did the risk of exposure. The law enforcement agencies were becoming more sophisticated, and they began to take organized crime more seriously. Luciano had always been adept at evading arrest and maintaining a clean public image, but with growing political pressure and public outcry, the noose began to tighten around him. Despite his efforts to maintain his distance from the more illicit aspects of the mafia, the authorities were now focusing squarely on him, determined to take down the man at the top of the criminal empire. In response to the mounting pressure, Luciano made a daring decision. He chose to leave the United States altogether. With his network of allies and the resources at his disposal, Luciano made arrangements to flee to Cuba, where he could continue to operate his empire from a safer distance. The decision was a significant turning point not just for Luciano but for the mafia as a whole. It marked the beginning of the end of the golden age of the street gangsters and the transition to a new era of organized crime. Luciano's departure was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. His empire was vast, and though he left the United States, he remained firmly in control of the operations that spanned the country. In Cuba, he could operate with less scrutiny, continuing to pull the strings from behind the scenes. However, his decision to leave was not without consequences. It signaled to both his allies and enemies that his reign was vulnerable, and it would be only a matter of time before someone else would try to take his place. The question of succession was an issue that would continue to haunt the mafia for years to come, and the cracks in Luciano's empire would eventually begin to show as rivalries intensified and new players entered the scene. The rise of Luciano's empire was not simply a tale of individual success, it was a testament to the delicate balance of power, loyalty, and betrayal that defined the mafia. His ability to navigate the complexities of the criminal world allowed him to become the most powerful figure in organized crime, but it also made him a target. The more successful Luciano became, the more his enemies, both within and outside the organization, were determined to take him down. And in the end, it was not a single rival or external force that brought him to his knees, it was the very system of power and loyalty that he had so carefully crafted. The world of organized crime was one of constant flux, and even the most powerful figures like Luciano were not immune to its unforgiving tides. As the tide of power began to shift, the mafia found itself entrenched in a hidden war. Beneath the surface of Luciano's seemingly indomitable empire, tensions were simmering, and rivalries were beginning to boil over. Luciano had spent years creating an organized, well-oiled criminal machine, and for a time, it seemed as though he was unstoppable. However, as is often the case in the world of organized crime, power never comes without challenges, especially when that power is as vast and complex as the one Luciano had built. The hidden war was not just a physical conflict between rival factions. It was also a psychological and strategic battle that involved manipulation, betrayal, and alliances made and broken in the shadows. The first sign of trouble came from within the ranks of the mafia itself. The more power Luciano amassed, the more men within his organization began to question the distribution of that power. In particular, There was a growing sense of discontent among some of the bosses who had originally aligned themselves with him. While Luciano had managed to keep the various families unified under the commission, there was always the potential for cracks to appear in the foundation. The commission, while an effective governing body for a time, also introduced a new dynamic, an environment where ambition and egos could flourish. The moment one of the powerful bosses felt slighted or believed they had been overlooked, it could lead to a struggle for power, as had already happened in the case of Vito Genovese. But it wasn't just the mafia's internal structure that was under threat. Luciano's operations were also coming under fire from external forces. The authorities, particularly the federal government, were finally beginning to take a more active stance against organized crime. While Luciano had always been adept at evading arrest through his political connections and his ability to keep a low profile, the increasing visibility of his empire meant that law enforcement was closing in. The rise of federal agencies like the FBI meant that the mafia's operations were becoming harder to conceal. The authorities were more organized, more resourceful, and more determined than ever to bring down the mafia. With each passing year, the stakes were growing higher, and the risks were becoming more significant. Luciano's ability to stay one step ahead of the law was unparalleled, but even he was not immune to the rising pressure. The hidden war was not just fought in the streets or behind the closed doors of mafia meetings, it was waged in the courts, in the media, and in the corridors of political power. The federal government was beginning to gain ground, and the organized crime world that Luciano had worked so hard to build was starting to feel the strain. Every move he made, every ally he trusted, every deal he brokered could potentially lead to his downfall. The level of scrutiny he faced was unprecedented, and for the first time in years, Luciano found himself facing the very real possibility of losing control, not just of his empire but of his freedom. Meanwhile, the war for control of the mafia was intensifying. The more Luciano's rivals saw his vulnerability, the more they were emboldened to challenge him. The internal power struggles that had simmered for years were now beginning to escalate, and the mafia was once again in danger of fracturing. The more Luciano's rivals tried to take advantage of his perceived weakness, the more desperate he became to maintain his grip on power. Luciano, ever the strategist, had to act quickly and decisively, but the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. He could not afford to alienate too many of his allies, nor could he risk appearing weak to the rest of the underworld. At the same time, Luciano was also facing increasing pressure from his former allies in the political and business world. Many of the men who had helped him build his empire were now starting to distance themselves from him, sensing that the tide was turning. They saw the growing power of law enforcement and the increasing instability within the mafia as signs that their association with Luciano might no longer be beneficial. These men, once indispensable to Luciano's operations, were now seeking ways to protect themselves and preserve their own interests. This sense of betrayal and abandonment only made the hidden war even more dangerous. It was no longer just about protecting the mafia, it was about protecting the legacy that Luciano had built. Luciano's life began to take on the weight of this conflict. He knew that the hidden war he was fighting was not one he could afford to lose. Every decision had consequences, and every alliance or betrayal could tip the balance. His position was becoming more precarious with each passing day, and he was forced to confront the possibility that his empire was not as secure as he had once believed. As much as he tried to maintain his calm, calculating demeanor, the reality was that the forces aligned against him were growing stronger, and his ability to control the situation was being tested like never before. In this environment of rising tensions, Luciano had to make a critical decision. Faced with the threat of an all-out war with his rivals, and with the law closing in, he chose to broker a deal that would allow him to maintain his power while avoiding the risk of a violent confrontation. Luciano's genius as a strategist lay not only in his ability to outthink his enemies but also in his willingness to adapt to the changing circumstances around him. He recognized that the old ways of dealing with challenges, through bloodshed and direct confrontation, were no longer viable. The situation had grown too complex, and the consequences of a full-scale war would be too costly for everyone involved. Instead of opting for violence, Luciano used his political connections to orchestrate a solution. He sought to create a new power structure within the mafia that would allow him to maintain control while placating his rivals. He offered concessions to those who were dissatisfied with his leadership, making them feel as though they were still part of the larger operation. This was not a show of weakness, it was a demonstration of his understanding of the psychological dynamics at play. Luciano knew that power was not just about force, it was about perception, influence, and the ability to manipulate people's emotions and desires. The decision to avoid open conflict and instead negotiate with his rivals was a calculated move, but it was not without its risks. It required Luciano to relinquish some of the absolute control he had once enjoyed, and it forced him to confront the reality that his empire was no longer the monolith it had once been. The hidden war was not one he could win with sheer force alone. It required a level of diplomacy and foresight that would allow him to outmaneuver his enemies while maintaining his grip on power. As Luciano's situation became more precarious, the hidden war took on new dimensions. It was no longer just a question of managing internal rivalries or evading the authorities. It was a question of maintaining his legacy and ensuring that the power he had spent so many years building would not slip away. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of failure were dire. For Luciano, the hidden war was a test of everything he had worked for, a test of his intellect, his ability to lead, and his capacity to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of the criminal underworld. Despite the pressure, Luciano's actions during this time only solidified his place as one of the most brilliant strategists the Mafia had ever seen. His ability to maintain control over the Mafia, even as the internal and external forces aligned against him grew stronger, demonstrated his unparalleled understanding of the complex dynamics of power. The hidden war he fought was not one of bloodshed and violence. It was a war fought through manipulation, diplomacy, and psychological tactics. And though it was one that would never be fully resolved, it would define the remainder of Luciano's reign and shape the future of the Mafia for years to come. As Luciano's empire continued to expand and stabilize, his reign came to an abrupt halt with his arrest, marking the beginning of his downfall. The fall of Lucky Luciano wasn't just a loss of power, it was the collapse of the very system that had made him the most powerful figure in organized crime. Luciano's fall from grace wasn't simply the result of a single event or betrayal, it was the culmination of a series of calculated moves by both his enemies and the authorities, who were finally closing in on the Mafia boss after years of strategic evasion. It all started with the relentless pursuit by law enforcement, particularly the federal government. In the early days of Luciano's empire, he had carefully cultivated a web of connections within politics, law enforcement, and even the military, ensuring that his criminal operations could continue undisturbed. He understood the importance of maintaining a low profile, using proxies and intermediaries to carry out the most sensitive operations. But as his power grew, so did the scrutiny on his activities. The more he expanded his empire, the harder it became for him to stay out of the limelight. His ability to hide in plain sight was a strategy that had worked for years, but as the federal government zeroed in on organized crime, this facade began to crumble. The turning point came when the U.S. government made organized crime a priority. The Mafia had long been seen as an underworld organization that operated beneath the surface of American society, but with the rise of modern investigative techniques, the authorities finally realized the extent of the Mafia's reach and power. At the forefront of the federal government's efforts was the newly formed Special Prosecution Bureau, a unit dedicated to taking down figures like Luciano. The government was no longer just interested in local racketeers, they wanted the heads of the criminal syndicates. Luciano had been on their radar for years, but now the hunt was on in earnest. The moment of betrayal came not from within his own ranks as was often the case in the Mafia world, but from a series of undercover investigations and wiretaps that were meticulously orchestrated by the authorities. They were able to infiltrate the inner workings of the Mafia, gaining crucial evidence against Luciano. The charges that ultimately led to his arrest, prostitution, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit various crimes, were damning. Despite Luciano's vast network of loyal allies, the federal government had finally accumulated enough evidence to bring charges against him that would stick. Luciano's downfall began to unfold like a carefully orchestrated drama. On February 2, 1936, after months of investigation, the authorities struck. Luciano was arrested at his apartment on charges of compulsory prostitution and racketeering. The charges, while based on his involvement in the sex trade, were a symbol of the broader criminal network he had built. The government sought to make an example of Luciano, not just as a criminal but as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the rise of organized crime in America. As the news of his arrest spread, the shockwaves were felt across the criminal underworld. For years, Luciano had been untouchable, a figure who seemed above the law. His legal acumen, combined with his ability to manipulate the system, had allowed him to avoid capture despite the numerous investigations into his activities. He was a master at deflecting attention and maintaining an air of invincibility. But now the facade was shattered. Luciano was taken to court, where his trial became a spectacle. The media frenzy surrounding his arrest was unparalleled. The courtroom was filled with journalists and onlookers, eager to witness the fall of the man who had controlled an empire. The trial was a dramatic and intense process. Luciano's defense team fought vehemently to keep him free, but the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. He had made many enemies over the years, both within and outside the mafia, and now those enemies were eager to see him brought down. The prosecution presented a compelling case, showing how Luciano had built his empire on a foundation of crime, corruption, and violence. Despite his best efforts, the court found him guilty of running a prostitution ring and sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentence was a crushing blow to Luciano. For a man who had once controlled the streets of New York, the idea of spending the rest of his life behind bars was unimaginable. The fall from power was swift and brutal. No longer the undisputed boss, Luciano was now just another prisoner in a system that he had once manipulated to his advantage. It wasn't just the loss of power that was painful, it was the loss of the world he had created. Luciano's empire, which had once seemed invulnerable, was now on the brink of collapse. But even as the walls closed in around him, Luciano refused to go quietly. His resilience and adaptability, which had allowed him to rise to the top of the mafia world, also helped him survive in prison. His leadership abilities didn't vanish overnight. Even behind bars, Luciano maintained a sense of control over his operations. His connections remained intact, and he continued to exert influence over his empire, albeit from a distance. The myth of Lucky Luciano was far from over. From his prison cell, Luciano began to work his charm once more. He cultivated relationships with influential figures in the government, using his connections to secure favors. One of the most crucial factors in Luciano's survival in prison was his ability to strike deals with the authorities. In 1946, after serving just 10 years of his sentence, Luciano's fate took another turn. The U.S. government, eager to stabilize the situation in post-war Italy, reached a deal with Luciano. The mafia had long been a significant force in Italy, and the U.S. saw the potential to use Luciano's influence to help secure the country's post-war order. Luciano was offered a deal. His sentence would be commuted, and in exchange he would be deported to Italy. This deal marked a dramatic shift in Luciano's life. From the streets of New York to the prisons of America, Luciano had now become a figure who transcended borders, his influence reaching beyond the confines of his criminal empire. However, this was not a triumphant return to glory. His years in prison had taken their toll, and the world he once ruled had changed. The mafia in the United States was evolving, and Luciano, now in exile, had to come to terms with the reality that his empire was no longer what it had been. Upon his release and deportation to Italy, Luciano was greeted with a mix of admiration and suspicion. While his reputation as a crime boss remained intact, the Italian authorities were wary of his influence. Luciano, however, made a successful transition from one underworld to another. He re-established connections with old allies in Sicily and began to forge new ones. Despite his exile, he continued to exert influence over mafia operations both in Italy and in the United States. Luciano's story didn't end in defeat. While his time as the uncontested boss of the American mafia was over, his legacy lived on. He may have been exiled, but his impact on the mafia and the criminal world was far-reaching. His leadership, his ability to build alliances, and his strategic mind made him an enduring figure in organized crime history. Even in his final years, Luciano continued to be a symbol of the power and influence that he had once wielded. The fall of Lucky Luciano was not just the end of a criminal empire, it marked the end of an era. His reign as the mastermind behind the most sophisticated criminal organization the world had ever seen was unparalleled. But even in the face of his conviction and exile, Luciano remained a force to be reckoned with. His fall was not just a personal defeat, it was a testament to the ever-changing dynamics of power, loyalty, and survival in the underworld. For Luciano, the end of his empire did not signify the end of his story. It was merely a new chapter in the saga of a man who had transformed the world of organized crime forever. The trial and subsequent sentencing of Lucky Luciano represented a watershed moment in the history of organized crime, not only for the immense personal loss he experienced but also for the shifting dynamics of the mafia itself. Luciano's trial was one of the most publicized and dramatic spectacles of its time, drawing attention from the press, the public, and most crucially law enforcement. For many, it seemed as though the once invincible mafia boss was finally being brought to justice. However, the trial itself revealed a deeper layer of Luciano's life and the complex web of power that had helped him navigate the criminal underworld for so long. The courtroom battle was a spectacle that gripped the nation. The case against Luciano was built on a range of criminal activities, most notably his involvement in running a large-scale prostitution ring. While prostitution had always been a cornerstone of organized crimes activities, the nature and scale of Luciano's operation made it impossible to ignore. The case brought to light his connections to numerous other criminal enterprises, and the prosecution worked tirelessly to connect him to every illicit activity, painting a portrait of a man who was not only ruthless but the mastermind behind a vast criminal network. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Luciano's defense team worked to discredit the charges. They argued that Luciano was nothing more than a scapegoat for the government's efforts to clean up organized crime, and that his arrest was part of a larger political agenda. Luciano, with his charismatic personality, took the stand in his own defense. He denied all the charges and maintained his innocence, claiming that he had been framed by corrupt officials eager to make an example out of him. The trial became a battle not just for Luciano's freedom but for the reputation of the mafia itself. As the courtroom drama unfolded, the public's fascination with the case only grew. To many, Luciano symbolized the rise and corruption of the American underworld, and the trial felt like the final chapter in his reign of power. However, despite the defense's best efforts, Luciano was convicted. The evidence against him was simply too strong. The courtroom drama culminated in a swift decision. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, a crushing blow to the man who had ruled over the mafia with such confidence for so many years. His conviction was a symbolic moment in the war between the mafia and the law, a clear victory for law enforcement and a sign that even the most powerful men in the underworld could be brought to justice. For the mafia, Luciano's arrest and conviction represented a turning point, signaling the fragility of their criminal empires, even when led by figures as cunning and powerful as Luciano. But the story of Lucky Luciano didn't end with his conviction. His trial and sentence were only the beginning of the next phase of his life, a phase that would be marked by a remarkable turn of events that showed the complexities of Luciano's character and his ability to navigate the shifting landscape of power. In prison, Luciano quickly proved that his leadership and influence weren't confined to the streets of New York or the boardrooms of the mafia. Even behind bars, Luciano remained a figure of importance. His network of loyal followers and allies within the prison system allowed him to maintain control over the mafia's operations, and his connections to politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement remained intact. Luciano's ability to operate from within the confines of a prison cell was a testament to his genius as a strategist and his unrelenting desire to retain power. Even though he had lost his freedom, he was still the man to whom other criminals turned for guidance, advice, and assistance. The government had succeeded in taking him off the streets, but they hadn't fully broken his influence. Luciano's ability to stay in control while incarcerated eventually led to a significant development in his story: his eventual release from prison. In 1946, after serving just 10 years of his lengthy sentence, Luciano was unexpectedly granted a commutation. The government, recognizing his influence in both the mafia and in Italian-American circles, saw an opportunity to use Luciano's power for its own interests. In exchange for his release, the U.S. government struck a deal with Luciano. He would be deported to Italy in exchange for his assistance in stabilizing the mafia's influence in post-war Italy, a country still struggling in the aftermath of World War II. Luciano's release was a carefully orchestrated political maneuver that marked a new chapter in his life. It also demonstrated just how deeply his influence had spread. Despite being exiled from the United States, Luciano's power was far from diminished. The government's decision to release him revealed the lengths they were willing to go to secure his cooperation. For Luciano, the deal represented a final twist in his saga, a chance to escape the confines of American prison life and, once again, position himself at the heart of the global criminal underworld. His deportation to Italy wasn't a triumphant return to the life he had once known. In fact, Luciano found himself exiled in a world that had changed dramatically in the years since he had been incarcerated. The mafia's power in America was evolving, and Luciano was no longer the undisputed kingpin. However, his legacy still loomed large and his name carried weight in both the U.S. and Europe. In Italy, he reconnected with old contacts and attempted to re-establish ties with the Sicilian mafia, but the political landscape had shifted. The world of crime he had known was no longer the same. The Sicilian mafia had its own leaders, and the post-war world was increasingly shaped by new global dynamics, making Luciano's efforts to regain his foothold more difficult. Despite the challenges, Luciano's influence endured. He continued to make strategic moves, engaging in behind-the-scenes negotiations and helping to shape the direction of organized crime, albeit in a less direct manner than he had before. His exile may have removed him from the power centers of the American mafia, but he remained a symbol of the underworld, a man whose legacy had not been entirely undone by his conviction. The story of Lucky Luciano's trial, conviction, and eventual release underscores the complex nature of his rise and fall. His trial marked the end of his reign as the undisputed boss of the American mafia, but it also served as a reminder of the far-reaching power he had wielded for so many years. The consequences of his conviction were profound, not just for him personally but for the mafia as a whole. His arrest was a significant blow to the underworld, but his ability to adapt, survive, and eventually regain influence even from behind bars spoke to the depth of his strategic genius and the enduring impact of his legacy on organized crime. Even in exile, Luciano continued to be a figure whose name was synonymous with power, control, and the complexities of loyalty and betrayal. His conviction and sentence may have marked a low point in his life, but they also marked the beginning of a new phase in the life of a man who had, in many ways, become larger than life itself. His story, filled with highs and lows, betrayals and second chances, remains one of the most enduring in the history of organized crime.